Flight 482 from New York to Chicago was, by all appearances, ordinary. Passengers settled into the rhythmic hum of a Boeing 737, a gentle drone that usually lulled them into complacency. Overhead bins clicked shut, and flight attendants walked down the aisles, smiling politely as they handed out peanuts and bottled water. Children squirmed in their seats, teens were glued to glowing screens, and adults buried themselves in magazines, work emails, or the familiar numbness of travel. Outside the small oval windows, the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the clouds in streaks of gold and orange. Among the passengers, one woman seemed almost out of place in her composed stillness. She was in her late 20s, striking but unassuming, with blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun and aviator sunglasses reflecting the dim cabin lights. Her posture was impeccable, her movements measured and deliberate. She didn't fidget, didn't scroll obsessively through her phone like the others, and she certainly didn't join the chatter about weather delays or the latest New York news. She simply observed. Every glance, every slight twitch of the passengers around her seemed catalogued and analyzed. Most didn't notice her, but that was exactly how she liked it. She had a secret, a life buried beneath a veneer of ordinary existence. Once she had been a fighter pilot, an elite Navy aviator who had taken off from aircraft carriers in the dead of night, launching into storms, executing split-second maneuvers at hundreds of miles per hour. That life was long gone. The medals were tucked away, the call signs erased from records, the camaraderie of jets and co-pilots replaced by quiet anonymity. She'd left that world behind, or so she thought. The first signs of trouble came subtly. A cough, sharp and sudden, erupted from the cockpit. Passengers glanced toward the front, curiosity piqued but unconcerned. Then a second cough, more violent this time. A shadow moved across the small glass window separating the cockpit from the cabin. And then the screams began. A flight attendant's voice shattered the usual calm. "Sir, are you okay?" The cockpit door rattled violently, then slammed as the first officer collapsed forward, hitting the controls with a sickening thud. The captain coughed violently, clutching his chest, his face pale beneath a sheen of sweat. Oxygen masks fell from above, dangling like ghostly reminders of the aircraft's vulnerability. Passengers froze, gripping their armrests as a collective realization dawned. Something was catastrophically wrong. The woman's instincts kicked in immediately. She unbuckled her seatbelt, moving quickly down the aisle with the grace of someone who had lived with high-stakes danger her entire life. She ignored the stares, the murmurs of disbelief, the small child clinging to a parent in confusion. In her mind, there was no hesitation, only the sharp, unrelenting focus of a pilot trained to make life-or-death decisions in fractions of a second. "Everyone stay calm," she commanded as she reached the cockpit door, her voice slicing through the panic like a knife. Flight attendants hesitated, unsure if she had any authority, but her presence alone commanded attention. The door was locked. Panic surged through her as she tugged at the handle, her mind calculating every possible scenario. Her thoughts raced through years of training, emergency drills, forced landings, sudden depressurization, engine failure simulations. She remembered her first night on the deck of an aircraft carrier, the roar of jet engines shaking her bones, the adrenaline so thick she could taste it. This was nothing compared to that, but the stakes were just as high. Finally, the lock disengaged. She pushed the door open, heart hammering, and was met with a scene of chaos. The captain, barely conscious, gasped for air, his hand clutching his chest as if he could hold the failing life inside him. The first officer lay slumped across the instrument panel, unmoving. Alarms blared in shrill, unrelenting wails, punctuating the frantic flashes of red lights that illuminated the cockpit like a violent warning. Her calm exterior hid the storm inside her mind. Every detail, the flicker of the engine monitors, the tremor in the yoke, the pressure differential, was logged instantly. This was more than a medical emergency. It was a potential crash in the making. She crouched briefly, scanning instruments she had not touched in years, running mental simulations faster than any computer could process. Passengers in the cabin pressed their faces to the windows and doors, eyes wide with fear, some whispering prayers, others openly sobbing. A mother clutched her young son tightly, whispering reassurances she didn't fully believe. The woman looked at them for a moment, her eyes meeting the boy's gaze. There was no time for comfort, only action. She climbed into the pilot's seat, the familiar leather embracing her like an old friend. Fingers brushed over the controls, and for the first time in years, a cold thrill ran through her. This was where she belonged, where instincts honed by thousands of hours in the sky converged with sheer, raw necessity. She checked gauges, toggled switches, confirmed altitudes, and calculated descent paths in a matter of seconds. Her mind was a battlefield, but she thrived in this chaos. "This is Captain Hayes," she said into the radio, her voice steady, controlled, commanding. "We have an emergency. Immediate clearance for descent required. Repeat, emergency descent." Static hissed back at her. The response from the tower crackled, but it was faint, uncertain. Then nothing. The cabin erupted in a mixture of panic and confusion. Flight attendants clutched railings, screaming parents struggled to calm their children, and passengers looked to her with silent, desperate hope. None of them knew who she really was. None of them could guess that the calm, composed woman at the front of the plane was once a fighter pilot capable of handling maneuvers that would terrify even seasoned commercial pilots. She adjusted her headset, eyes narrowing on the radar display. Thunderstorms loomed ahead over Lake Michigan, black clouds twisting violently, lightning stabbing through the dark like white-hot daggers. The plane would have to navigate through them. One miscalculation and everyone on board could die. She took a deep breath, centering herself. Her training, buried under years of civilian life, surged forward, an instinctive rhythm of motion and decision-making. She didn't have the luxury of fear, not now, not ever. The passengers whispered, watching her every movement. The boy in 14B squeezed his mother's hand, his wide eyes locked on her like he could sense the difference between ordinary and extraordinary. And then the plane shuddered violently, the first jolt of turbulence running through the fuselage like a warning. Drinks sloshed, trays clattered, and the lights flickered as the aircraft fought against unseen forces in the sky. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the yoke. This was no simulation. This was real. People's lives, every single one of them, depended on the next move she made. A metallic groan echoed from the left engine. Smoke curled faintly near the wing. She froze for a fraction of a second, calculating angles, force, wind shear, and emergency protocols. Her lips pressed into a thin line. There was no time to panic. There was no time to think about who she had been. She was exactly who she needed to be now. And the storm outside was only beginning. The cockpit was a blur of flashing lights, warning sirens, and acrid smoke. The faint hiss of the oxygen masks in the cabin below competed with the groans of the captain and the unmoving first officer. Yet amid this chaos, the woman's mind clicked into focus, razor-sharp and unyielding. Her hands moved instinctively over the controls, flipping switches, stabilizing altitudes, checking engine parameters, all the motions ingrained from countless hours in high-speed life-or-death situations. Every decision, every calculation came from muscle memory, trained over years of fighter jet combat and emergency simulations. She allowed herself a quick scan of the instruments. The left engine's vibrations were irregular, a subtle but unmistakable sign of imminent failure. The altimeter indicated a steady 35,000 feet, but turbulence threatened to toss the plane like a paper airplane. Flaps were unresponsive, the autopilot blinking uncertainly, the fuel gauge dipping faster than it should. Every second mattered. Every second could be the difference between survival and catastrophe. Flight 482, respond. This is air traffic control. Please identify your status, came the voice through static, distant yet urgent. Her fingers flew over the radio, voice steady, confident. This is Captain Hayes. We are experiencing a dual medical and mechanical emergency. requesting immediate guidance and clearance for emergency descent. Static, then crackling again. The response was delayed, uncertain, almost fearful. Flight 482, weather conditions, severe turbulence, advise caution. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the cockpit in eerie silence, save for the alarms and engine whines. She exhaled sharply. No assistance would be forthcoming for the next critical minutes. She was alone at the helm with dozens of lives dependent on her actions. Her gaze flicked to the first officer. He was unconscious, slumped over the controls. The captain's labored breathing punctuated the room, each inhale sounding like it might be his last. She pressed a hand gently to his shoulder. His eyes fluttered open, confusion and fear swimming across his features. You're a pilot," he whispered hoarsely, disbelief lining every syllable. "I've flown jets that make this look like a tricycle," she replied, tight-lipped. No time for conversation. Her mind raced as she calculated options. The plane had 2 engines, one failing, and she needed to descend safely into Chicago's O'Hare Airport through a storm that could shred smaller aircraft. The left engine could fail entirely at any moment. The storm's lightning crackled closer, illuminating the thick cloud cover outside with ghostly flashes, each strike a stark reminder that every second counted. In the cabin, passengers sensed the tension before they understood it. Drinks sloshed, trays rattled, and a collective unease filled the air. Flight attendants moved briskly up and down the aisles, trying to calm crying children, hold panicking adults, and keep control of the situation. She could see the fear reflected in every face, hear it in every sob and whisper. Yet she couldn't reassure them, not yet. Every motion had to be calculated, every decision deliberate. She was not just fighting the plane, she was fighting time. Her fingers traced over the yoke, adjusting flaps, checking engine pressures, recalculating altitude. She remembered every catapult launch, every evasive maneuver, every mid-air emergency from her fighter-pilot days. The memories were sharp, visceral, almost overwhelming, but they fueled her precision. Instinct, training, and sheer willpower became a single, unstoppable force. She glanced at the young boy in 14B, sitting rigid beside his mother. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and for a fleeting moment he seemed to recognize the woman not just as a passenger but as someone extraordinary. She caught his gaze, and a quiet determination surged through her. She would not fail, not for him, not for anyone. The left engine's noise escalated, a low grinding roar that sent shivers through the fuselage. Sparks flickered faintly from the wingtip, visible through the small windows. A shudder ran through the plane. Passengers gasped, some gripping armrests until their knuckles whitened. Drinks spilled onto laps and the cabin lights flickered, casting eerie shadows. She spoke to the captain, her voice calm, authoritative. "I need you conscious and alert. Can you help me monitor the systems?" He coughed violently, then nodded weakly. "I'll try," he rasped. She took a deep breath. Emergency descent. Manual override. She disengaged autopilot, feeling the familiar tension in her hands, the subtle pushback of the yoke against sudden maneuvers. The plane lurched as turbulence slammed against the fuselage. Lightning lit the cabin in stark, white flashes, revealing terrified faces and clutched hands. She adjusted the throttles, banking gently to counter the gusts of wind. Instinct took over, angles, speed, drag, and lift calculated in milliseconds. The aircraft responded to her touch, trembling like a wild animal under the control of someone who knew how to tame it. Below, the cloud cover thickened, dark and impenetrable. No visual guidance. Every movement had to be precise. One wrong tilt, one misjudged angle, and the plane could stall or spin into disaster. "Captain Hayes," the tower crackled faintly. "We are visibility 0, advise course, proceed with caution." Her pulse quickened, but she refused to show hesitation. "Copy," she replied, descending at maximum safe rate, maintaining control. Flight 482 is in your hands momentarily, but the final approach will be executed manually. The cockpit shuddered again. Sparks flickered in the engine panel. She flicked switches with lightning speed, monitoring fuel, air pressure, and engine integrity. She could feel the strain in every bolt, every panel, every instrument. And then a sudden jolt, a violent twisting motion that threw her forward. The left engine groaned ominously, smoke curling faintly from the cowling. The plane tilted and passengers screamed. She gritted her teeth, pressed her body against the seat, and countered instinctively, rolling the yoke to stabilize the aircraft. Her mind raced through contingencies. Engine failure protocol, emergency landing sequences, descent trajectory adjustments, passenger safety measures. She was in full command, yet every instinct screamed that this was only the beginning. From the cabin came a frightened voice, a child's whisper, "Are we going to die?" She glanced back briefly, locking eyes with the boy. "Not if I can help it," she said softly, her voice carrying authority, reassurance, and steel. She didn't explain who she was, didn't need to. They didn't need the history, the medals, the jet launches. They needed survival, and she was determined to give it to them. The storm outside intensified. Lightning struck closer, illuminating the wing with terrifying proximity. The left engine shuddered violently, then steadied, almost as if mocking her. She pressed her lips together, willing the machinery to hold just long enough. She tapped into the rhythm of the aircraft, the subtle vibrations, the pitch, the engine tone. Every movement from the plane told her a story. She could feel imbalances before they became dangerous, anticipate turbulence before it hit. Her fingers danced over the controls, adjusting, compensating, countering. This was no ordinary pilot. This was someone who had once dominated the sky at supersonic speeds, now navigating death at 35,000 feet. Suddenly, the plane lurched again, more violently than before. A loud metallic snap echoed from the fuselage. Sparks burst faintly near the left wing. She froze for a split second, then pressed forward, countering the tilt. Her heart pounded, but her movements remained precise, controlled, deliberate. The passengers screamed. Flight attendants shouted instructions they barely believed themselves. The woman's eyes flicked over the instruments, and then to the horizon she couldn't see, and back to the controls. She whispered under her breath, almost as if invoking a mantra, "Stay calm, focus, survive." And in that moment, as the plane groaned under stress and the storm showed no mercy, she realized something. She hadn't flown a commercial jet in years. She hadn't dealt with civilian passengers, distractions, or cockpit politics. But the fundamental truth remained the same. In the sky, there is no room for fear, only action. And she was ready. The cockpit was a maelstrom of lights, alarms, and shrieking metal. Every instrument screamed warnings, every flickering panel reminded her that the plane was alive, unpredictable, and dangerous. She had taken the pilot's seat, but taking control wasn't enough. She had to dominate the aircraft, anticipate every movement, every tremor of turbulence, every push and pull from the failing engine. Her fingers moved over the yoke with practiced precision. The left engine groaned intermittently, smoke trailing faintly from the cowling, sparks threatening at the edges. She calculated in milliseconds, thrust adjustments, flap angles, descent rate, fuel consumption. Years of fighter-pilot instinct surged to the forefront of her mind. The Boeing 737 was far slower, far heavier than an F-18, but the principles were the same. Maintain control, anticipate danger, and never hesitate. "Captain Hayes," the weak voice of the first officer rasped beside her, we might not make it." She didn't flinch. "We will," she said firmly, almost harshly. There was no time for doubt. Fear was a luxury passengers could not afford, and she certainly couldn't indulge it herself. She adjusted throttles again, the plane lurching violently as the storm tossed it like a paper boat in a maelstrom. Lightning illuminated the clouds in jagged white arcs, revealing glimpses of the terrified faces below. From the cabin, cries rose above the drone of the engines. A mother clutched her 2-year-old child tightly. A young man whispered prayers he didn't believe in. An elderly woman gripped her armrest until her knuckles bled. All eyes were on the cockpit door, some instinctively sensing that someone extraordinary had taken charge. None of them, of course, knew the full truth. She checked the radio again, trying to establish contact. Flight 482 to O'Hare Tower. We have an emergency descent underway. Require immediate assistance. Requesting landing vectors. Static, then a voice, almost drowned in the storm. Flight 482, wind speeds exceeding limits. Visibility near zero, proceed with caution. Caution wasn't an option. Precision was. Survival was. Her mind raced. The plane had 2 engines, but the left one was faltering. The right engine was carrying almost the entire load of thrust, and every adjustment sent a tremor through the fuselage. She could feel the strain in the yoke, the subtle vibrations through the rudder pedals, the tiny shifts in weight and balance that could spell disaster if mishandled. She activated the plane's manual override, disengaging autopilot entirely. Her hands and feet worked in synchrony, her body attuned to every shudder, every vibration. The plane groaned and the cabin lurched with each correction. Passengers pressed into their seats, hearts racing, eyes wide. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened," the flight attendant announced, trying to keep a calm voice. "We are experiencing turbulence. Your cooperation is critical." But words were not enough. People screamed, clutched at each other, tried to calm crying children. The cabin was a storm inside the storm, every person grappling with the realization that death could be seconds away. She had no time to comfort them. She had to act. She glanced at the left engine. Smoke trailed thicker now, the smell of burning oil faintly creeping into the cockpit. A grinding noise emanated from the fuselage. She pressed her lips together, forcing herself to ignore the panic clawing at her gut. Instinct, training, and muscle memory surged. She flipped switches, adjusted throttles, and calculated emergency descent trajectories. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the runway she couldn't yet see. Her eyes flicked to the altimeter, the airspeed indicator, the engine gauges, all demanding instantaneous decisions. A deep breath, a mental checklist, and she executed maneuvers that would challenge even the most experienced commercial pilot. The plane shuddered violently. Sparks flew from the left engine cowling. A metallic groan echoed across the fuselage. She pressed forward, countering the tilt with precise banking, feeling the forces push her body against the seat. The autopilot could never have handled this. Only human intuition, honed to perfection under extreme pressure, could. She looked briefly at the captain, who was pale and sweating, clutching the side panel for support. "Trust me," she said, a steely calm in her voice. "We're going to get through this." The boy in 14B watched her, wide-eyed, clinging to his mother. Something in her posture, her unwavering control, seemed to reassure him, even in the midst of chaos. She offered him a faint nod, a silent promise. "I won't let this plane fall." Lightning struck closer, illuminating the left wing in a terrifying glow. The plane tilted dangerously, threatening to spiral. She countered instinctively, adjusting flaps and thrust, feeling the subtle drag and lift calculations running through her mind. Sweat poured down her temples, but her movements were precise, almost surgical. From the cabin came a scream as turbulence rocked the plane again. Drinks flew, trays clattered, people braced themselves for impact. She kept her focus on the instruments, scanning, adjusting, calculating. Each second was a battle. Each second was a test of skill and nerve. Then a new threat revealed itself. The left engine had begun to fail completely. A sharp metallic snap echoed through the fuselage. Sparks flew visibly from the cowling. Smoke thickened. The cabin lurched violently. Panic surged through the passengers like a tidal wave. Her mind raced. Emergency protocols, engine shutdown, manual compensation, emergency descent trajectory, calculation of safe angles for landing, fuel ratios, weight balance, passenger safety. Every variable was critical. There was no room for error. She adjusted throttles again, her hands steady despite the tremor in her stomach. The plane groaned under stress, but she could feel the rhythm returning, the subtle pushback of forces as she stabilized the aircraft. The storm was relentless, but for the first time she had a sense of control, a dangerous, tenuous control, but control nonetheless. The radio crackled. Flight 482, visibility near zero, we cannot provide guidance, advise caution. Her jaw tightened. No guidance, no support, no assistance. She was on her own. Every life on this plane was her responsibility, and she would not fail. She leaned into the yoke, eyes scanning the horizon she couldn't see, instruments reflecting every critical metric. Her heart pounded, adrenaline surged, but her movements remained precise. Every flick of a switch, every subtle adjustment to throttle or rudder was the difference between survival and catastrophe. From the cabin, whispers of fear began to mix with murmurs of hope. Passengers sensed it, the calm authority, the decisive movements of the woman at the front. They didn't know her name, her history, or her experience, but instinctively they knew someone extraordinary was in control. A flash of lightning revealed the runway ahead, momentarily visible through the thick storm clouds. She swallowed, adjusted flaps, throttled back slightly, and prepared for the approach. This was the moment of truth, the culmination of every split-second decision, every calculation, every instinct honed over years of high-stakes flight. And then the left engine groaned, threatening to fail completely. Sparks flew, smoke billowed, and the plane shuddered violently. The cabin screamed. Time seemed to stretch, every heartbeat echoing in her ears. She pressed forward, clutching the yoke, her entire being focused on the single mission: keep the plane in the sky. The storm was merciless. The runway was obscured. Passengers clutched each other, crying, whispering prayers, and holding onto hope they didn't even realize they had placed in the woman at the helm. She was no longer just a passenger, no longer just a woman with a hidden past. She was the guardian of Flight 482, the line between life and death, the only thing standing between chaos and survival. And the storm was only beginning. The plane shuddered violently, rattling down the aisle of the Boeing 737 like a leaf caught in a storm-tossed river. Overhead lights flickered as turbulence slammed against the fuselage, sending drinks, papers, and trays of food flying into passengers' laps. Screams erupted from every row. Children cried, parents shouted reassurances they didn't feel, and flight attendants clutched anything steady to keep from being thrown off balance. Chaos had officially arrived at 35,000 feet. In the cockpit she was calm. Calm as a storm, calm as a predator. Her hands were white-knuckled on the yoke, eyes darting across gauges and screens. Every vibration, every tremor, every alarm fed her instincts. The left engine was sputtering, smoke curling along the cowling, sparks faintly flickering. The right engine was straining under the added load, fighting to keep the aircraft level. Lightning tore across the sky, jagged bolts illuminating the storm clouds with a violent white light. She adjusted throttles, banking slightly to counter the sudden gusts. The plane responded, but not smoothly. Turbulence threw it like a rag doll. She leaned into the yoke, muscles coiled like springs, calculating angles, wind speed, and lift in milliseconds. Her mind raced. If the left engine went out completely, she'd have to perform an emergency landing in the storm without visual reference. Every second counted. Below her, the cabin was pandemonium. A mother held a toddler to her chest, whispering prayers that went unanswered. An elderly man clutched his seatbelt until his knuckles turned white. A young woman screamed and then sobbed, her hands covering her face. Each sound pulled at her heart, but she couldn't let it. Panic was contagious. She had to be the calm center in the hurricane. She spoke into the radio, her voice slicing through the storm and static like a lifeline. Flight 482 to O'Hare. We are experiencing severe turbulence and partial engine failure. Request immediate clearance for emergency landing. I repeat, emergency landing. Static crackled, then a faint, almost fearful response. Flight 482, proceed with caution, wind gusts exceeding limits, runway visibility 0. She gritted her teeth. They were offering no help. There would be no vector guidance, no precise instructions. Only her skill, her instinct, and sheer determination stood between the passengers and disaster. The left engine groaned again, a metallic protest that sent a shiver through the cockpit and a tremor through the plane. Sparks flickered from the cowling. She pressed forward, countering the tilt with a combination of rudder and yoke adjustments. The plane lurched violently, almost tipping toward a complete roll. Everyone remained calm, seatbelts fastened. The flight attendant yelled, voice cracking but authoritative as she moved down the aisle, hands gripping overhead bars for support. Passengers clutched each other, praying, screaming, or silently crying. The cabin was a storm within a storm, every heartbeat and breath amplified by terror. She glanced briefly at the captain, pale and gasping for air. "We can do this," she said, her voice firm, leaving no room for doubt. "We're going to get through this." The boy in 14B, holding tightly to his mother, whispered, "Mom, she's a hero, right?" His mother's eyes widened, unsure how to respond. The woman at the helm didn't hear him, but instinctively she knew every eye in the cabin was on her, looking for salvation in the midst of chaos. Lightning struck again, close enough to illuminate the wing in stark, terrifying detail. She adjusted flaps, throttles, and rudder, banking to counter the violent turbulence. Sweat streamed down her temples, rain from condensation forming streaks across the cockpit windows. Every second was a test, every movement a calculation in life and death. Suddenly the plane lurched violently to the left. Sparks shot from the engine cowling. The fuselage groaned and the plane tilted perilously. She fought against the controls, compensating instinctively, muscle memory guiding her hands and feet. The passengers screamed again. Drinks spilled across laps, papers flew through the air, and the cabin lights flickered dangerously. She scanned the instruments. Altitude stable barely, airspeed dangerously high, the left engine threatening to fail completely, the right engine under extreme strain, the storm showing no mercy. Every adjustment was critical, every minor miscalculation could tip the aircraft into an unrecoverable spin. She leaned forward, jaw tight, eyes sharp, every instinct firing. Her mind ran through emergency protocols at lightning speed, engine shutdown, flap adjustments, descent trajectory, landing approach calculations. She was the only thing standing between the plane and catastrophe. And then a terrifying realization. The storm was worse than she anticipated. Winds were pushing the plane sideways, gusting unpredictably, threatening to push it off its path. Lightning illuminated the clouds, revealing ominous black towers of cumulonimbus swirling like angry giants around the plane. She had no visual reference for the runway, no instrument guidance from the tower, and the engines were groaning under the stress. She swallowed hard, feeling the adrenaline surge through her body. This was no longer a simple emergency descent. This was survival, not just hers, but every life on board. The captain groaned beside her. I don't know if we," his words trailed off, fear evident in every syllable. She turned to him sharply. "We don't have time for doubt. Watch the instruments. Help me stabilize the plane." He nodded weakly, gripping the side console. She adjusted the throttles again, banking the plane against the gusts, feeling the vibrations through the yoke, sensing the faint tremor that hinted at the left engine's imminent failure. Sparks flickered again, smoke curling from the cowling. The fuselage groaned under the strain. From the cabin came a chorus of fear, screams, sobs, whispered prayers, and gasps. The mother in row 12 clutched her child, rocking him gently, whispering desperately, "It's okay, we'll be fine." But the fear was palpable. Every passenger was aware that something extraordinary and terrifying was happening in the cockpit. Lightning struck again, illuminating the plane in white-hot clarity. She felt the plane's response to the gusts, adjusted flaps, throttles, rudder, everything in perfect synchrony. Muscle memory and instinct merged into a single, precise command. She could feel the aircraft's weight shifting, the turbulence pushing it, the engine straining, and she fought against all of it. The boy in 14B whispered again, "She's going to save us. Is she?" His mother pressed a hand to his mouth, unsure how to respond, but somehow understanding that this woman at the helm was their only hope. The left engine groaned violently, sparks flying brighter, smoke thickening. The plane tilted dangerously again. She pressed forward, countering with precise banking, every motion critical. Instruments flashed warnings she had to read and interpret in seconds. Failure was not an option. The storm raged, the plane shuddered, the cabin screamed, but she remained focused, calm, decisive. Every passenger, every crew member, every life in that plane depended on her ability to stay steady in the storm, to outmaneuver the chaos surrounding them. And she knew, deep down, that what was coming next would test every skill she had ever learned, every nerve, every ounce of training. Because survival was no longer guaranteed, the grinding noise started as a low, ominous hum. It grew into a harsh metallic scream that vibrated through the entire fuselage. Sparks flickered more intensely from the left engine cowling, smoke now curling thickly into the night air. Every vibration, every shudder of the plane resonated in the cockpit like a warning. The left engine was failing completely. She gritted her teeth, her eyes scanning the instruments with laser focus. The altimeter wavered, airspeed dipped, and the yaw indicator screamed warnings. The storm outside battered the plane with unrelenting fury. Wind gusts pushed it sideways, lightning illuminated the wings in terrifying detail, and the rain lashed the fuselage like 1,000 needles. Every moment now was life or death. "Left engine, imminent failure," she muttered under her breath. Her hands worked instinctively, flipping switches, adjusting throttles, balancing weight, and calculating descent angles. Years of fighter jet training surged forward, instinct overriding fear. She didn't have the luxury to think, she had to act. In the cabin, panic was mounting. Flight attendants shouted instructions, trying to calm passengers whose eyes were wide with terror. Drinks, trays, and personal belongings flew across the aisles as turbulence slammed the plane. The mother in row 12 clutched her child, whispering prayers she barely believed. The elderly man gripped the seatbelt straps until his knuckles bled. And yet, amid the chaos, passengers sensed the calm authority emanating from the cockpit. Some instinctively turned to the woman, hoping that her presence meant survival. They didn't know her past, her history, the countless lives she had saved as a fighter pilot. They only knew that she was the only person standing between them and the storm outside. The left engine gave a violent cough, a metallic bang that rattled the cockpit panels. Sparks erupted more vividly now, smoke filling the corner of the cockpit. She pressed forward against the yoke, countering the violent tilt, banking precisely, calculating every microsecond of movement. Her mind worked in a constant loop. Emergency shutdown procedures, thrust redistribution, flap adjustments, weight balance, descent trajectory. The captain, weak and shaking, whispered hoarsely, I don't know if it can hold." She shot him a sharp glance. "It will hold. Focus on the instruments. Help me stabilize the aircraft. We're not losing this plane today." The plane shuddered violently, tossing her forward in the cockpit seat. Sparks danced from the left engine like tiny fireworks, illuminating her face in stark flashes. Sweat streamed down her temples, mixing with condensation forming on the cockpit windows. Every passenger below screamed, some crying, some whispering frantic prayers, their voices swallowed by the roar of the storm. She adjusted the throttles on the right engine, compensating for the left engine's imminent failure. The aircraft tilted dangerously, threatening to roll. Instinct and muscle memory guided her hands and feet with precision. Years of high-speed carrier landings, evasive maneuvers, and split-second decision-making in fighter jets merged into a singular, unwavering purpose: keep this plane in the sky. Lightning illuminated the runway below briefly through a gap in the storm clouds. The visual was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but enough for her to adjust. The plane lurched again, turbulence rocking it violently. Sparks from the engine flickered brighter, smoke now curling in thick, black clouds. From the cabin, a scream rose, a child, terrified, gripping a parent so tightly it seemed he might crush her. A mother whispered prayers into her child's hair, tears streaming down her face. Flight attendants clung to overhead rails, shouting over the chaos, their faces pale with fear. She spoke aloud, mostly to herself, mostly to anchor her own nerves. Left engine failing, prepare for emergency maneuvers, stabilize, descend, survive. Each word reinforced her focus, her resolve, her mastery over the storm and the failing machinery. The left engine coughed violently, then groaned ominously, smoke now pouring steadily. Sparks flickered along the fuselage. The plane tilted again and the fuselage creaked with tension. She pressed forward, correcting the tilt with precise yoke movements, rudder adjustments, and throttle management. Each second brought her closer to disaster or salvation. The boy in 14B whispered again to his mother, "She's going to save us, isn't she?" His mother, still clutching him, nodded slightly, eyes wide with terror and hope. No one else in the cabin knew who this woman really was, but instinctively everyone felt her authority, her skill, her determination. She engaged the emergency procedures for a single-engine descent, redistributing thrust, adjusting flaps, and calculating the safest path for the landing. Her mind raced faster than any computer could. Every variable, engine strain, wind gusts, turbulence, fuel, weight, descent angle, passenger safety, running simultaneously. Mistakes were not an option. Another violent lurch threw her forward. Sparks from the left engine illuminated the cockpit in blinding flashes. The alarm screamed louder, warning of impending catastrophe. The plane groaned like a living thing under stress. Every passenger screamed, gripping seatbelts, praying, whispering farewells. She pressed her forehead against the yoke briefly, centering herself. Years of training, years of survival instinct, years of high-speed maneuvers in life-or-death situations fused into one clear thought: we survive or we die. No hesitation. With a precise maneuver, she banked the aircraft slightly, adjusting the descent trajectory. The right engine roared under the added load, responding to her touch. The plane stabilized, at least momentarily. Sparks still danced from the left engine, smoke trailing thickly, but she had control, enough control to continue the descent toward the obscured runway. She glanced at the captain, who nodded weakly. "Good work," he rasped, disbelief in his eyes. You might just pull this off." She didn't respond. Every fiber of her being was focused on the instruments, the plane, the storm, the lives at stake. The cabin below was a mixture of terror and hope. Passengers sensed that their fate rested entirely in her hands, and they silently prayed she would not fail. Lightning cracked across the sky again, illuminating the clouds in jagged white arcs. Rain lashed the fuselage. Turbulence shook the plane violently, and the left engine groaned, sparks flying like the first warning signs of complete failure. She adjusted the flaps and throttles, banking the aircraft with surgical precision. "Prepare for descent," she muttered almost to herself. "Prepare for landing. Steady, steady." The plane responded to her touch, trembling under the storm but holding, just barely. Every second stretched into an eternity. Every heartbeat counted. Every decision was a gamble between life and death. The storm outside showed no mercy. The left engine smoked, the fuselage groaned, the lightning cracked closer. Below, passengers clutched each other, gripping seatbelts, whispering prayers, holding onto the one hope that remained, the woman at the controls. And she knew, deep down, that the real test was about to begin. Because survival wasn't just about keeping the plane steady anymore. It was about landing this 737, damaged, struggling, barely holding together, in a storm that would rip apart even the most experienced commercial pilots. And she was the only person capable of making it happen. The runway at O'Hare Airport was barely visible, obscured by sheets of driving rain and the jagged brilliance of lightning slicing through black clouds. Below, puddles rippled violently, reflecting the stormy sky like fractured mirrors. From 35,000 feet, it looked like a distant promise, almost unreachable. But it was the only hope, the only chance to save everyone on Flight 482. Her fingers gripped the yoke like an extension of her body. Sweat streamed down her face, stinging her eyes, mixing with the condensation on the cockpit windows. The left engine screamed, threatening to give out completely. Sparks danced like fireworks along the cowling, smoke curling upward in thick black plumes. The plane shuddered under the weight of its own strain. The right engine was doing all the work now, its thrumming loud in the cockpit. She could feel the subtle pitch changes, the drag from flaps and wings battling the wind. Turbulence slammed them sideways, jolting the plane violently. Her stomach lurched in tandem with every shudder. She was no stranger to high-risk situations, but commercial jets were not F-18s. The scale, the inertia, the sheer mass of the aircraft demanded calculations she had only ever made in theory during training. The captain coughed beside her, leaning weakly against the panel. "We were close, right?" he rasped, voice barely audible over the roar of engines and wind. She shook her head slightly, grimly assessing the instruments. Close enough to see the runway, but not close enough to risk a mistake. This is going to be manual. We fly blind for the final approach. I need you monitoring fuel and instruments. No mistakes. He nodded weakly. His eyes widened as he glanced at her, finally seeing what everyone in the cabin was beginning to feel. The steel, the precision, the unwavering confidence of someone who had once lived in far deadlier skis. Lightning illuminated the runway again, if only for a split second. She banked, aligning the plane as best she could with the invisible path. Wind gusted sharply, threatening to push them off course. She adjusted flaps and rudder, compensating for each gust, feeling the subtle tremor in the fuselage as the plane resisted her corrections. Every second stretched into an eternity. From the cabin, passengers clutched one another, whispering prayers, gasping, eyes wide. The boy in 14B held tightly to his mother, whispering again, "She's going to save us." She caught a glimpse of them in a reflection from the cockpit window and gave a barely perceptible nod. She couldn't speak to them, not yet, but the gesture was enough. The left engine groaned, smoke trailing thicker now. Sparks leapt violently along the cowling. She pressed forward, countering the tilt, banking, adjusting throttle. Every maneuver was precise, calculated in milliseconds. Mistakes were fatal. There was no margin for error. The storm intensified. Rain pelted the windshield like a barrage of needles, lightning struck closer, and the wind howled with deafening force. Visibility was near zero. Her instruments flickered with warning lights, some struggling under the power surge. The plane trembled, almost rebelling against the control she exerted. "Steady, steady," she muttered, voice tight but controlled. She adjusted throttles again, keeping the nose slightly higher to maintain lift while preparing for descent. Airspeed fluctuated dangerously. Altitude dropped faster than she wanted. Her hands and feet moved in perfect unison, as if the plane were an extension of her body. The captain, weak and trembling, monitored systems and fuel. "Left engine. Can't hold much longer," he said, voice hoarse, barely audible over the storm. "I know," she replied, jaw tight. "We'll make it. Focus on the numbers. I'll handle the rest." Lightning illuminated the runway again, long, wet, reflective, yet blurred and distorted. She mentally ran the emergency landing checklist. Flaps fully extended, gear down, throttle adjusted, landing trajectory calculated to perfection. The plane was heavy, the left engine failing, the wind violent, but she had one chance, one perfect approach. A violent gust pushed the plane sideways. Sparks flew from the left engine, smoke curling thickly. The fuselage creaked under stress. She corrected instantly, banking against the wind, adjusting throttle, flap, rudder, all in a seamless, practiced rhythm. Every decision, every movement was survival distilled into action. From the cabin, the tension was palpable. Passengers had stopped screaming, frozen in a tense, fearful anticipation. Flight attendants braced themselves, whispering reassurances they barely believed. The mother in row 12 whispered prayers over her child. The elderly man held his seatbelt straps with white-knuckled grip. Everyone, in some way, was aware that this woman at the helm was their only hope. The plane descended further. Rain lashed the windshield, lightning illuminated the clouds, turbulence slammed against the fuselage. Sparks erupted from the left engine like a warning. Her hands danced over the controls, guiding, correcting, compensating for every unpredictable gust, every tremor, every movement of the failing machinery. She could feel the stress on the plane, the slight tilt, the tremor in the wings, the irregular vibrations from the left engine. Every adjustment had to be perfect. One wrong calculation, one delayed reaction, and the plane would spiral. She gritted her teeth, pushing adrenaline and fear aside, letting only precision guide her actions. The boy in 14B whispered to his mother again, She's amazing." His mother's eyes glistened with tears. They didn't know her past. They didn't know she had flown F-18s off aircraft carriers, that she had survived storms and combat situations far deadlier. All they knew was the calm, unwavering presence of someone who could hold this plane together against impossible odds. Another jolt. The fuselage groaned, the left engine coughed violently. Sparks flew again, smoke thickening. The plane tilted dangerously. She pressed forward, adjusting flaps and rudder, banking slightly, throttling the right engine to compensate. Instruments screamed warnings. Airspeed fluctuated. Altitude dropped faster than she wanted. "Focus, focus, focus," she muttered, teeth gritted. She could feel the weight of every life on board pressing down on her. Every passenger, every flight attendant, every crew member, they were all relying on her. She could not fail. The storm showed no mercy. Lightning flashed, illuminating the plane in stark white brilliance. Rain pounded the fuselage, wind howled, turbulence rocked the aircraft. Yet she remained steady, precise, calm, a force of nature herself against the fury of the elements. She made the final adjustments, preparing for the landing sequence. Flaps extended fully, gear down. The plane descended steadily despite the failing left engine. Every calculation, every maneuver, every instinct merged into a singular focus. Get this plane down safely, no matter what it took. And in that moment, as the runway approached, barely visible through the storm, she felt it. The culmination of every split-second decision, every calculation, every ounce of skill honed over years of fighter jet flight. Survival was possible, but only if she remained perfect. Because even a single misstep now would mean disaster. The runway was barely a ghost in the storm's relentless assault, a smeared line of wet asphalt reflecting jagged flashes of lightning. The wind screamed through the fuselage, buffeting the plane violently, twisting it unpredictably. Rain pelted the windows like a hail of needles, making visibility near zero. Yet there it was, just ahead, a faint promise of safety in the chaos. Her hands clamped the yoke with unshakable precision. Every instrument, every tremor, every vibration of the plane screamed danger. The left engine sputtered violently, smoke curling into the cockpit like dark clouds foreshadowing doom. Sparks flickered along the cowling with each strain, warning that failure was imminent. But she ignored the panic clawing at her gut. This was her world, and she would dominate it. The right engine roared under the strain, every thrust measured and deliberate. Flaps extended fully, landing gear deployed with a loud clunk that vibrated through the cabin. She felt the weight of the aircraft shift, every ounce of force fighting her precise adjustments. She leaned into the yoke, banking slightly against the storm, correcting for wind gusts that threatened to throw the plane off course. From the cabin came cries of fear, whispered prayers, and the tense silence of people holding their breath. Flight attendants clung to rails, gripping tightly, offering whatever words of reassurance they could muster. The mother in row 12 held her son tightly, whispering, "It's okay, she's in control, we'll be fine." The child clung to her, eyes wide but trusting the calm authority emanating from the cockpit. She glanced at the captain, pale and exhausted. "We're almost there," she said firmly, every word deliberate. "We're landing, keep monitoring systems, no distractions." He nodded weakly, eyes wide with disbelief. You might actually do this," he rasped. She didn't answer. There was no time for conversation, only action. Lightning split the sky again, illuminating the runway in a brief, blinding glare. She adjusted throttle and rudder, banking slightly to counter gusts of wind. The plane shuddered violently as turbulence struck. Sparks flew from the left engine, smoke billowed thicker, but she fought against the chaos with every ounce of skill she possessed. The instruments screamed, warning of decreasing altitude, engine failure, and extreme wind shear. She filtered out the alarms in her mind, focusing only on what mattered, stabilizing the plane for touchdown. Muscle memory and instinct guided her hands and feet in perfect synchronization. Every minor adjustment was critical. One error, one delayed reaction, and the plane could spin, crash, and kill everyone on board. From the cabin, passengers whispered, gasped, prayed. The young boy in 14B squeezed his mother's hand tightly. She's going to save us," he whispered. His mother nodded, tears streaming down her face. The collective hope of everyone on board clung to the woman at the controls. They didn't know her past, didn't know she had once flown supersonic jets off aircraft carriers. They only knew that she was their lifeline. The left engine gave a violent cough and sputter, sparks flying more violently. Smoke filled the cockpit corner, curling toward the ceiling. She adjusted throttle, flaps, and rudder simultaneously, banking slightly, descending at a precise angle, inching closer to the runway. The wind gusted violently and the plane tilted dangerously. Her jaw tightened, every muscle coiled, every nerve firing. "Flaps full, gear down steady," she muttered under her breath. Her voice was calm, but her mind was razor-sharp, calculating descent speed, angle, thrust, wind drift, and turbulence in real time. There was no room for hesitation. Lightning illuminated the runway again, a perfect, fleeting glimpse. She adjusted, aligning the plane for final touchdown. The aircraft shuddered as turbulence hit. Sparks from the left engine burst violently. Smoke thickened. The fuselage groaned under stress. The passengers screamed, clutched each other, and braced for impact. Her hands flew over the yoke and throttle, rudder adjustments, flap corrections, microbanks to counter gusts. Each second was a battle. Each heartbeat was life or death. The runway drew closer, but so did the limits of the aircraft's endurance. She spoke to the captain, voice calm but firm. "We're close. Prepare for impact. I need you ready to assist if anything goes wrong." He swallowed hard, gripping his console. "Yes, ma'am." The plane lurched violently, almost tipping. Sparks from the left engine flared brighter. Smoke poured into the cockpit. The yoke shook in her hands. She leaned forward, banking slightly, throttling the right engine with precision, correcting for the wind, the turbulence, and the failing left engine. From the cabin came a collective gasp as the aircraft dipped lower. Rain lashed violently, the fuselage groaning under stress. Flight attendants screamed instructions over the roar. Every passenger was acutely aware of the near-impossible landing happening just ahead. Lightning flashed, illuminating the runway clearly. She adjusted her descent angle by mere degrees, flaps and gear responding perfectly. Inches separated disaster from survival. Sweat streamed down her temples. Her heart raced, but her hands were steady, her mind razor-focused. The left engine gave a final shudder, sparks erupting violently. She pressed forward on the yoke, banking slightly, throttling with precision. The runway grew larger in the windshield view. Inches now separated life from death. She descended steadily, the plane trembling under every gust and mechanical stress. The right engine roared, carrying almost the entire weight. Turbulence threatened to spin them, but she countered with flawless precision. Flaps and gear aligned perfectly. The first wheel touched the wet asphalt. A violent jolt reverberated through the fuselage. Sparks erupted from the left engine, smoke curling along the wing, but she held the plane steady, throttle adjusting, rudder compensating. Every passenger held their breath. The second wheel touched, another jolt. The plane shuddered violently, sparks flared, smoke thickened. She pressed forward, maintaining alignment. And finally the nose wheel landed. The fuselage groaned under weight. She applied brakes carefully, countering hydroplaning on the rain-slick runway. The plane slowed, shuddering but stable. The storm raged around them, but Flight 482 was on the ground. Miraculously, completely intact. In the cabin, passengers erupted into cries of relief and gratitude. Some hugged, some wept, some whispered prayers. The mother in row 12 held her son tightly, tears streaming down both faces. Flight attendants wept, overwhelmed by the near miracle they had just witnessed. The boy in 14B looked up at the cockpit with wide eyes. She gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the bond forged in terror and survival. The captain exhaled shakily beside her, disbelief written across his face. I can't believe you did it. You saved us." She allowed herself a small, exhausted smile. "We did it. Everyone survived. That's all that matters." Outside, emergency vehicles had already arrived, their lights flashing through the rain. Passengers began disembarking, trembling, faces pale but alive. Cameras flashed from journalists and airport personnel who had witnessed the storm's aftermath and the impossible landing. And somewhere in the chaos, a single thought struck her. This wasn't just survival. This was proof. Proof that the skills, the instinct, the training she thought she had left behind were still alive. That in the face of impossible odds, she could still rise. Flight 482 had landed, battered but whole. And the woman who had once flown fighter jets, now quietly sitting in a commercial cockpit, had done what no one thought possible. But even as relief washed over the passengers, a lingering question remained in everyone's mind. Who was she really? And how had she pulled off the impossible? The storm finally began to relent, the rain falling in steady sheets rather than the violent onslaught that had battered Flight 482. Emergency crews surrounded the Boeing 737, flashing lights illuminating the soaked tarmac. Passengers disembarked in stunned silence, some trembling, others crying with relief. Cameras from news crews captured every moment, every terrified yet grateful face, but all eyes kept flicking toward the cockpit, the woman who had done the impossible. Inside the cockpit, she finally allowed herself to exhale. Her hands loosened on the yoke, still trembling from the adrenaline. The left engine smoked faintly, sparks flickering one last time, a final reminder of how close they had come to disaster. The right engine hummed steadily, still alive, still carrying the aircraft to safety. The captain, pale and shaken, turned to her with disbelief etched into every line of his face. I don't know how to thank you. You saved everyone." His voice faltered, emotion overriding protocol. She shook her head, brushing a strand of wet hair from her eyes. "You don't need to thank me. Just make sure everyone is okay." The passengers were slowly gathering near the aircraft, many still clinging to their loved ones, some hugging strangers they had shared terror with. A woman from row 16, tears streaking her face, approached the cockpit window. "Who are you?" she asked, voice trembling. How did you do that?" For the first time, she allowed herself a small smile, faint pride flickering beneath exhaustion. "Let's just say, I've had some experience flying planes. Military experience." The murmurs began almost immediately. A passenger whispered to another, "Military, fighter pilot." Cameras from journalists on the tarmac captured the stunned faces of crew and passengers alike. Her secret, until now, hidden beneath layers of civilian life, had been revealed by her actions. The boy from 14B ran forward, clutching his mother's hand. He stopped near the cockpit window, eyes wide. "Are you really a fighter pilot?" he asked. She leaned down to his level, smiling gently. "Yes, but today I was just a pilot doing my best to get everyone home safely." The crowd outside erupted in a mixture of relief, awe, and gratitude. News crews scrambled to capture her identity, to ask questions, to understand the person behind the miraculous landing. She had saved lives, and now the world wanted to know who had done the impossible. The captain finally spoke again, voice still shaky. "I should have recognized your skill earlier, the way you handled the plane. It was beyond anything I've ever seen. You could have flown anything, anywhere. And you did it here with passengers who didn't even know what they were facing." She shook her head. "It wasn't about me. It was about them. The passengers, the crew. Every life on this plane mattered more than my ego, my past, or anything else. That's what kept me focused." A reporter from the media pushed forward, microphone extended. "Can you tell us your name? How did you survive something like this and land a Boeing 737 in those conditions?" For a long moment she hesitated. She could reveal her full identity, her years of elite training as a fighter pilot, her deployments, her accolades. But she had lived quietly since leaving the military. She had chosen a civilian life, blending into anonymity. Yet the world deserved the truth. Her voice was calm, steady, carrying the weight of authority she had honed over decades. "My name is Captain Rachel Hayes," she said. "I am a former U.S. Air Force fighter pilot. Today, I relied on every skill I've learned to bring Flight 482 safely to the ground. That's all I can say right now. Every life aboard mattered more than anything else." A hush fell over the crowd. Cameras zoomed in. Passengers whispered, stunned. Crew members nodded in quiet reverence. The story had gone from miraculous landing to astonishing revelation. The calm authority of someone who had lived life at Mach speeds in combat had saved them all. The boy from 14B whispered to his mother again, awestruck. "She's amazing, like a superhero." His mother nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, she is." Rachel allowed herself to step out of the cockpit. Rain-slicked hair clung to her face, clothing soaked, but her posture remained strong, poised. Emergency personnel approached, ready to assist, but she shook her head. She had done her job. Her responsibility had ended the moment everyone was safe. Passengers moved closer, some offering hugs, some shaking her hand, some simply standing in silent gratitude. Words were inadequate to express what they felt, how she had walked into chaos, into a storm, and wrested control from fate itself. She had turned near-certain disaster into a triumph of skill, calm, and courage. The media outside scrambled to get every detail. Cameras flashed, questions shouted. How had she remained calm? How had she anticipated every turbulence, every mechanical failure? How had she saved so many lives? Rachel allowed herself a small smile. "Experience," she said softly, "and the understanding that panic never saves anyone, only action, only focus. That's what matters when lives are on the line." As the adrenaline faded, the gravity of the event settled in. She looked around at the passengers and crew, faces pale but alive, trembling but safe. Every person on Flight 482 had a story now. Every person had witnessed something extraordinary. The captain approached again, voice quieter now, more personal. "You saved everyone, not just because you're skilled, but because you didn't hesitate. You took control when no one else could. That's beyond words." Rachel nodded, finally allowing herself a brief moment of relief. "It's not about me, it's about them. That's always been the only thing that mattered." The boy ran forward again, handing her a small drawing he had made on the plane, crumpled and wet from turbulence. "Thank you," he said simply, eyes wide. "You saved us." She knelt briefly, taking the drawing. "You're welcome," she said softly. "Just promise me you'll always pay attention and be brave, okay?" The crowd outside, the media, the emergency crews, and the passengers slowly absorbed the reality. They had survived an impossible storm, landed a Boeing 737 with a failing engine, and survived because of one extraordinary woman. A former fighter pilot, now civilian, whose skills had not faded, whose courage had not waned. And as Rachel stepped away from the plane, finally free of the cockpit's weight, she allowed herself a long, deep breath. The storm had passed. Lives had been saved. Secrets had been revealed. The world had witnessed the improbable, the extraordinary, the impossible made real. She looked up at the night sky, now calmer, the clouds parting slightly. Somewhere in the distance, the hum of emergency vehicles and media chatter surrounded her, but for the first time since the storm began, she felt peace. She had done what few could. She had faced chaos, fear, and uncertainty, and emerged not just unbroken but triumphant. Flight 482 would live in memory, not for the storm, the panic, or the danger, but for the courage, skill, and resolve of one woman who refused to let fate decide the outcome. And as the passengers slowly dispersed, whispering thanks, sharing tears and embraces, one undeniable truth settled. Nobody had known her full story, her past, her incredible skills. But now the world did, and they would never forget it. Captain Rachel Hayes, former fighter pilot, had saved Flight 482. And in that moment, the quiet hero finally allowed herself a small, victorious smile.